The title of Unit 3 is Human Populations and Impacts on Biodiversity. And I kind of did it in reverse order. I talked about the impact on biodiversity of human populations first, and now we're going to talk about human population growth. Everything we learned in Unit 2 about population growth is still going to be true. So a small population, given a large number of resources and lots of space, will grow exponentially. As that population continues to increase, it will approach a carrying capacity, and competition for resources will become more intense, and competition slows down population growth, so the curve will level off and hit that carrying capacity, and it'll become kind of capped off there. Now, if you have an opportunistic species, you may remember from Unit 2, they have a tendency to completely overshoot the carrying capacity because they reproduce so quickly that the lack of resources, the scarcity of resources, doesn't have a chance to have an effect on the reproductive rate before all of those resources are completely depleted. So you get a few generations past that carrying capacity, and then suddenly all of those resources are gone, and then you have these rapid population busts where there's a big die-off of all of the species there. Then you have other species that are equilibrial. They reproduce relatively slowly, and they have a small number of very well cared for offspring. And as they approach their carrying capacity, because they reproduce much slower, their reproductive rate is much more influenced by that competition as it gets closer and closer to that carrying capacity. So they don't have these big die-offs. They slow down before they get to the carrying capacity, and therefore they stay right there at that carrying capacity once they reach it. So you have opportunistic and equilibrial species. Now, here's the question for you. Are humans an opportunistic species or an equilibrial species? Select an answer to verify your understanding, and I'll keep talking in a second. So if you just go off the behavior that I mentioned a moment ago, humans are very clearly an equilibrial species. We have a small number of very well cared for offspring, right? We reproduce relatively slowly, a couple of kids at a time, and years in between reproduction, and we take care of our offspring for decades, right? 20 years pretty commonly, sometimes longer than that. I still ask my dad for help on projects all the time, so we're almost the poster childs for equilibrial species. An opportunistic species, say mice, might have, a mouse mom might have a dozen pups, and she's just not going to be able to spend as much time caring for each and every one as much as, say, this gorilla is going to be able to take care of that one baby gorilla right there. There will be some parental care with mice, obviously, but with large numbers of offspring and short period of time before those baby mice reach reproductive maturity, it's just not going to be as much of an investment per baby mouse as you get per, say, gorilla offspring. So humans are more like this gorilla. We are more equilibrial. Now, with that noted, take a look at this graph, which has a time scale on the x-axis from the year 1500, so over 500 years ago, all the way up through 2050. So the data here is going to be real data up until it surpasses the present, and then after that point it's going to be based on statistics and models. And this is going to be a graph of the human population over time. Before the Industrial Revolution, our population held pretty steady. We never got past 1 billion people. A pretty small human population worldwide. Let me get a y-axis on this graph. This is going to model the annual increase of the number of people in the population over time. So this is not the total human population. This is how many millions of people are added at each chunk of time. And watch this, right? Pretty small, pretty small, pretty small, pretty small. Big jump, big jump. And the jump begins right when the Industrial Revolution begins, right? So right around the 1700s, 1800s, we start adding lots and lots more people. And we get more, we add more, we add more, we add more, we add more. But look at this. Since the 1960s, we've still been adding more and more people. Remember, this is how many people have been added to the population. But the number that we are adding has actually been slowing down over time. We've been decreasing how many new humans are being added. So the population is still growing. It is still growing. All of these bar graphs indicate adding more people. But the rate at which we are growing is actually slowing down. Now, in red, I'm going to put the total population in billions. And here we go. This is a measurement of our population over time. And you can see that it holds pretty steady from 1500 moving forward. We're at like 500 million people, less than around there. We get up to about 1 billion people somewhere in the 1750s, maybe, somewhere around there. Maybe 1800, and then we start getting this J-shaped population growth curve, and that should look familiar. Any population that is relatively small compared to the number of resources present to it will have a J-shaped population growth curve, but then as we start skyrocketing up, and now as we're getting into the present era, we're actually starting to see the growth curve level off. So for a while, people were looking at this J-shaped population growth curve, and they were drawing analogies to these opportunistic species that have these boom and bust cycles. They said our population is going to overshoot our carrying capacity, we're going to deplete ourselves of food, and then there's going to be a huge population crash, right? We're all going to, it's going to be, the whole human population is going to starve, just like when there's too many deer out in the forest and there's no hunters to take them down, right? Mass population crash. But you can actually see that what's happening is that humans are following a logistic growth curve, an S-shaped growth curve, and it's just now starting to slow down somewhere. And we're not exactly sure what the carrying capacity is going to be, but it looks like it's going to be around 10 billion people, maybe 9 billion people, somewhere around there. So we are currently right in between the 2000 and 2050 barrier right here. And this graph was made using older data, so they were making projections at this point in the future. But you can see that it's actually pretty darn close, where it's showing that we will be crossing the 8 billion person threshold soon. The current human population on Earth is just over 7.9 billion humans. So we have continued to grow in that fashion ever since. And the data we've collected is supporting this notion that the population growth rate, while its population is still growing, it's slowing down. The study of statistics such as births, deaths, or migration when it concerns the human population is called demography, and a lot of these next slides are going to have to do with demographics. Now, one of your learning objectives, and I think I may have covered this in an earlier video, but one of your learning objectives for the course says you need to know not only the current population of humans on the planet, but also the percentage of those humans which live in the United States. Only about 4% of the human population lives in the United States. And the reason why it's important to understand that is to more clearly appreciate that the lifestyle that we enjoy in the United States, or that many of us enjoy in the United States, because obviously there are problems here too, is not the typical experience of humans on the planet. We live in a highly developed country, while the majority of the human population lives in less developed countries. So we're going to talk a little bit about the way that countries are evaluated economically and some of the conditions that we find in different locations across the planet. But first, I want to talk about this graph. Why was our population holding steady at about 500 million people for such a long period of time? Well, it's because that was our carrying capacity. So we are an equilibrial species, and we sit at our carrying capacity, because that's the amount of people that the environment could hold. But then you see this graph where it's a J-shaped growth curve, and we are way, way overshooting that, and that's why people were concerned. We're saying, oh, this was our carrying capacity, and now our population is many, many times that. That should be a concern of ours. But then you see it leveling off at the top, which is what it does when it's coming up against the bottom of the carrying capacity. So what's going on? What humans have effectively done is we raised our carrying capacity. We increased our carrying capacity. We are perhaps the only species that had the technological capability to alter the conditions in which we found ourselves, and by altering our environment, we changed the game. We looked at all of the things that were killing us, predators that were hunting us, diseases that were killing us, and we one by one systematically eliminated them, decreasing our death rate. We looked at how we were gathering food, and we came up with better ways to get food, better ways to do agriculture, better ways to raise livestock, so we increased the availability of food. We took our environment and we turned it into one that had more abundant resources, which created the situation, like those rabbits being introduced to Australia, where you had a relatively small population compared to the ample resources that were suddenly available. So our population had a J-shaped exponential growth curve in that situation, because we had raised our carrying capacity. What are the main ways in which we raised our carrying capacity? I have them listed here. Nutrition, sanitation, healthcare. So let's talk about those a little bit, these human ingenuities that raised our carrying capacity. So sanitation is the big one. People undervalue what an incredible invention soap was, how much that improved, how much simply cleaning ourselves has increased our overall health span of our lives and decreased the rate at which we receive viruses and bacteria and get infected with things. So our understanding of the role of microbes has led to an increase in the use of soap and antiseptic and water purification tactics and the use of clean bandages. They used to reuse bandages from infected patients. Someone would die from their infection and, well, we got all these bandages. Someone else needs a bandage. We'll just reuse that, because we didn't know that microbes, that germs, made you sick. We hadn't developed the germ theory of disease until much later on. As recently as the Civil War, people would just reuse bandages because we thought that the reasons why someone got sick was either because they smelled bad smells, which was called miasma theory, that smelling bad things made you sick. This is what was going around at the time of the Black Plague. And then also we had this idea of that there were 4 humors, 4 liquids that were in your body, blood and mucus and black bile and yellow bile, I think are the 4. And we thought that just having the wrong ratio of those 4 things was the other thing that could make you sick. And that's why they would bleed people or use leeches in order to try to help rebalance their humors. But once we understood that we started using clean bandages and washing wounds and doing all of these practices that started to be introduced, cleaning our surgical instruments in between patients, suddenly we stopped losing so many patients, and survival rates from minor infections started to increase pretty substantially. We figured out that you get cholera from drinking water that's contaminated with the bacteria that dwell in human feces. So we stopped dumping our human waste upstream of where we were getting our water supply from, and suddenly people stopped getting sick nearly as frequently. The World Health Organization estimates that interventions in water supply, sanitation, and hygiene reduced diarrheal incidence on average by a quarter, 25%, and child mortality by 65%, because in a lot of places, problems of water sanitation and hygiene and these kinds of concerns that we often think about as almost being solved problems, they are still one of the main factors that lead to childhood mortality or adult mortality in some cases. So one of the reasons why mortality rates in the human population started to go down, indoor plumbing, organized garbage pickup. We stopped just dumping our trash and our waste directly into the streets. We had street sweepers that cleaned up the animal waste because we had all these horse-drawn carriages, and we didn't just leave animal droppings and, in fact, dead animals just lying around in the streets, which also was breeding bacteria and disease. Until the end of the 19th century, many streets in cities such as New York and London were filled with garbage and manure. And as just one example, the manure on London streets attracted such large numbers of flies that And the flies spread typhoid fever. They were biting flies. And then the contaminated water from all of this stuff in the streets was spreading cholera and dysentery. So never underestimate the effect that very simple public services has, right? Garbage collection, basic sanitation, water purification for the water going to your home, soap dispensers in public areas, right, for washing your hands. All of these things are some of what contributed to humans having long, healthy lifespans. Now, as I say, most people do not live in highly developed countries. So there's still about 2.5 billion people in the world, about 40% of the population, who do not have access to adequate sanitation. They do not have indoor plumbing, and this leads to a practice called open defecation, which basically, if you don't have any place to use the bathroom, you just make a bathroom wherever you can, and this leads to the spread of parasites and viruses and bacteria. And this is why there's actually a very large focus on digging latrines in a lot of less developed countries. This is one of Jimmy Carter's things that he's done since being a president. Is he's gone around with his organization, I forget the name of it right now, and they've been just installing latrines everywhere that they possibly can in order to decrease the rate of open defecation and therefore decrease the rates of infection from these preventable diseases. The contamination of drinking water leads to 1.5 million deaths per year, according to UN estimates. So not all of these amenities are equally distributed. Healthcare is another big reason why we were able to decrease the death rate of the human population. So sanitation decreased the rate of infection, right? We were already living much healthier just from having all these sanitation practices, but then we developed these other technologies that helped those who were sick to actually be able to recover from any kind of illness that they have. Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin. He had some mold grow on one of his petri dishes. He noticed that none of the bacteria he was working with, the Streptococcus bacteria he was working with, would grow anywhere near the mold. He hypothesized that there was some sort of chemical being produced by that mold that was impeding the growth of the bacteria, and he isolated this chemical, penicillin. Other scientists later tested it and discovered, yes, it actually can be used to fight bacterial infections. Antibiotics only work against bacterial infections. And since then, we have created many, many, many more antibiotics. And we overuse them now to a great extent, but they are one of the greatest achievements of medical science, that these pathogens that have been plaguing us since the beginning of the human race, suddenly we had a weapon to be able to fight back against them, to be able to completely eliminate them from someone's body, to get rid of an infection in the course of a couple days or a week regimen of antibiotics. So very remarkable, these sudden advances in healthcare. Vaccination, the development of vaccines to prevent anyone from getting certain types of viruses in the first place, another huge achievement of healthcare. Antibiotics can work against bacterial infections. Vaccination can work against viruses. It can prevent someone from ever getting the virus ahead of time by showing the immune system, hey, it's like a wanted poster. Keep a lookout for this thing, a protein that'll show up on that virus's surface, and the immune system says, got it, and then when the virus does show up, it takes care of it immediately. Vaccines are amongst the greatest achievements of mankind. Through vaccination campaigns, we have been able to create a level of immunity in our population so thorough that some viruses have been completely eliminated from the population. Smallpox, I should say only smallpox has been totally eliminated. Most of them decrease the rate of infection and the rate of spread in the population so much that the infections become much, much rarer. And even when you do get, say you get the flu kills people in many cases. People with a weakened immune system, people who have never received a vaccine, people who don't have access to medical technology. But if you are vaccinated against different strains of the flu, and this is why you need a new flu vaccine every year is because viruses evolve very rapidly, and you need a new vaccine against the new strain. But you will have some protection against that, and it will be not as bad as you would have been without the vaccine. And this is also true of the COVID-19 vaccines. One of the advantages about vaccines is the more people who become vaccinated against a virus in your population, the less places that virus has to escape to and find an incubator, right? Every person who gets infected with the virus becomes a viral incubator. They create many more copies of the virus, and they can infect more people. And then, if you infect 3 people, those 3 people will each infect 3 people. So now we go from 1 person being infected to 4 people being infected to 13 people being infected, because 1 + 3 + 9, to 40 people being infected, and so on. With every opportunity the virus has to replicate, it has another chance to mutate and get another strain of the virus, which is where beta and Delta and Mu and Omicron for COVID came from, and where the different strains of the flu come from every year. It comes from mutation and natural selection. So as there are fewer and fewer people who have the capacity to get infected, the virus doesn't have the ability to spread and mutate, and you get what's called herd immunity. If you have someone who absolutely cannot get the vaccine, someone with a lowered immune system, or they have some sort of allergy to an ingredient in the vaccine, the medical doctor has told them, you cannot get this vaccine for this reason or that reason, they can get a measure of protection simply by the fact that everyone that they interact with is vaccinated. So there's no vector, no angle that the vaccine has to infect them, because no one that they interact with can get infected. And those people will be much less likely to be infected if no one that they interact with is infected. So the more and more people that get the vaccine, the less likely it is that the virus would get to those individuals that would end up dying from that virus. And that is ultimately what vaccination campaigns are about. It's about saving the people who are elderly, those with weakened immune systems, those who have a substantially increased likelihood of death if they get infected with the virus. The side benefit that you yourself are less likely to get sick it's a bonus. It's also nice, but ultimately we are trying to protect the most vulnerable people in the population. It's a everyone coming together teamwork strategy. Now, I spent a little bit more time talking about vaccines than I strictly needed to, because there is a lot of misinformation about vaccines going around right now. And it would take me a very long time to go through item by item, knock it all down. But one thing I noted going around was the idea that in order to get herd immunity, we want to get as many people infected with the virus as possible. And you might notice that that wouldn't work by the way I just described it. The more people that are infected, the more likely it is that the most vulnerable people in our population would get the virus. Whereas the more people that are vaccinated, the less likely those vulnerable people would actually get infected and then die from the virus. Herd immunity is achieved by vaccination. Letting a virus run rampant and infect as many people as possible is not an effective strategy to getting herd immunity. That is how you let a population die of a plague. And it's also a really good way to generate as many new variants of the virus as you possibly can. So, back to the topic at hand, human population growth. Why did the human population skyrocket? Well, we decreased our own mortality rate. How did we decrease our own mortality rate? One of the things was sanitation, and one of the things was healthcare. Antibiotics and vaccination were 2 big discoveries that dramatically decreased the rate at which humans were dying in the population. But there were other medical technologies as well. The development of anesthesia was actually a really big medical development. Up here we have a photo of someone undergoing surgery in a time before anesthesia. Before we had the ability to numb people, or we had the ability to safely knock them out, you would just have some large guys hold them down. Sometimes you would strap them down with leather straps, But someone would have to be awake and fully aware of, say, a leg amputation. If they had an infected leg, it would have to be sawed off, and they would just be there screaming and fighting the whole time. So why am I saying that anesthesia was a big development for helping us save human lives? Obviously, it decreased the amount of trauma involved. But imagine how much more precise surgery became when patients were able to actually remain completely still during the process, right? How much more precision surgeons were able to use and make very, very fine cuts and go in precisely and remove just this little bit of tissue here and sew that up very precisely. Much easier process, right? A lot easier to make precise, very tiny work of things. Imaging technology, right? The development of X-rays and other types of imaging technology, MRI machines. This allows us to see where there are problems in someone's body without having to cut into them. That is a huge leap forward in medical technology, the ability to actually determine that there's a problem without having to damage someone's body in the process of getting that knowledge. Additional scientific knowledge that includes all of these other things that we've discussed, but every time we make leaps in scientific knowledge, we also improve our ability to save lives quite frequently, because science is the mechanism by which we determine which ideas accurately reflect the world around us and which ones do not accurately reflect the world around us. And once that work is done, we can improve all of our techniques and our tactics and our approaches. So, for example, these are some images taken from a book, a tome written in 1514, right at the beginning of when the human population started increasing, from a textbook called De Humani Corporis Fabrica, written by Andreas Vesalius. And the reason why this book is special is it's one of the first, perhaps the first, medical textbook that was written using information gotten from dissecting human cadavers. Prior to this, medical students, doctors, would learn everything that they knew about human anatomy and physiology by copying down the works of an ancient Greek doctor named Galen. And Galen developed everything he knew from folklore, from old information about medicine, and by dissecting pigs and dogs and other types of organisms. He was definitely a scholar and a scientist. He investigated how things were constructed, how animals were put together, but not human bodies. He just kind of assumed that humans were probably constructed in a pretty similar way, because there was a cultural taboo for a very long time against any kind of manipulation or cutting into or doing anything with a human corpse. And it wasn't until Andreas Vesalius, there were other doctors doing this, but he's the one that published a book, kind of pushed that taboo and decided to get all this information, that we started to get good medical information that was actually based on real human anatomy. And what also makes this book special is that he got essentially Renaissance master artists or apprentices to master artists to come in and do the illustrations for all these books. So if you take a look at this, right, a normal medical textbook, you'll see the body standing flat, made with the head turned to one side with the palms faced up, right? That's kind of the standard anatomical pose. But all of the illustrations in this book have them in these dynamic poses, as though they're reciting Shakespeare on a stage, right? The bodies are twisting and being used. They are active, right? You see this skull with a cross section in it, and they've taken time to do all this subtle cross-hatching and all these fibers of the beard, right? All these hairs of the beard and all of that. Like, the artistry of this manuscript is absolutely incredible. But the reason why I bring it up is because prior to this, we were basing all of medical science on the anatomy of pigs, on the anatomy of dogs, on the anatomy of other organisms that weren't humans. So right about the time when the human population starts exploding is about when we decided to start basing medical technology off human anatomy. And finally, nutrition. As humans transition from, say, hunter-gatherer type societies over to agriculture, to farming and tilling the land and deliberately growing crops year to year, the number of people that we could sustain in any given area began to increase because we were deliberately growing the food for it. We weren't out fending for it, looking for rare bits of food. We were creating the food for ourselves. But at the beginning, agricultural technology was not that sophisticated. It amounted to little more than just kind of planting the seeds in the soil in kind of clusters so we knew where to look for it and grab it the next time it was growing around. But over time, we figured out that, if we add some manure, some fertilizer into the soil, that's better. Or if we bury some organic matter, like fish or something like that, in with the soil, that can help in this situation. Or we began to realize that, if we pull out some of these other plants that are competing for water and nutrients in the soil, these weeds, then that will actually help the plants that we do want to grow to be able to come out. If we keep the herbivores that are trying to eat our plants away at the early stages, that'll allow us to get more food, so we can build fences around our farms, and that will help keep some of those out. Or maybe we'll employ a dog to help guard our farm. That'll also help with our sheep and cattle as well. They can help protect them and help herd them, that sort of thing. And slowly but surely, we started to develop more technology, and with every technological increase, our ability to grow more and more food increased, and therefore the carrying capacity of humans on the planet also increased. So again, we were raising that carrying capacity. We were decreasing the death rate and also increasing the available number of resources for the people that were alive. And now, as we've talked about earlier, we have industrialized agriculture. We have very complicated irrigation methodologies. We have crop rotation and contour farming. This is contour farming up here, using this hillside and the contours of the hillside to your advantage to allow the water to kind of move from one bed of crops to the other bed of crops as rain is coming down. We used to only farm on flat territory, but we figured out how we can sustain crops on these kind of hilly territories as well, which increase the amount of space available for producing food. We developed artificial fertilizers around the 1930s, I should say. And that dramatically increased our food output. We artificially selected crops and also created other types of GMO crops. Remember, artificial selection is a type of genetic manipulation. So artificially selected crops are, at least scientifically speaking, a kind of GMO. In terms of whether or not it meets that criteria for listing in the grocery store, no, it doesn't. So take a look at this. Estimates state we grow enough food to feed 10 billion people annually on planet Earth. On an earlier slide in this video, we said that there are 7.9 billion people on Earth right now. So we grow enough food to feed every person on Earth plus an extra 2 billion. There's enough for excess food for everyone on Earth. However, people are still hungry. We know that there are places where people are not getting enough food to eat, where there is mass starvation. We know that people are suffering from malnutrition, and not just in less developed countries. In the United States, people are suffering from food insecurity. So how is that possible, that we grow enough food to feed 10 billion, which is more people than exist, but there are still so many people that are not getting enough to eat? And it has to do, again, with economics and with transportation. And that's going to be the topic of the next video.